The morning of October 25, 1944, Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell circled his Grumman F F Hellcat fighter above Task Force 38.3, 700 miles east of the Philippine coast. Through breaks in the cloud layer, he could see 15 American aircraft carriers steaming in precise formation, their flight decks alive with activity. McCampbell had already downed multiple enemy aircraft that morning, but what he witnessed next would change his understanding of naval warfare entirely. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. At 0600 hours, radar operators aboard the carriers detected a massive Japanese air formation approaching from the west. 76 aircraft, a mix of Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, Aichi D 4Y dive bombers, and Nakajima B 6N torpedo bombers, had launched from Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's northern force. The formation flew in tight coordination, a textbook execution of the Imperial Japanese Navy's doctrine for attacking enemy carriers. The Japanese pilots expected to find American carriers vulnerable, their fighter screens thin, their anti-aircraft defenses overwhelmed by numbers. They found instead a killing ground that would earn a permanent place in aviation history. The mathematics of Japanese carrier vulnerability had been written years before the first American Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bomber ever lifted off from a flight deck. In 1938, when the Imperial Japanese Navy commissioned the carrier Shokaku, Japanese naval architects had made deliberate design choices that prioritized offensive striking power over defensive resilience. The carrier's anti-aircraft battery consisted of 16 5-inch guns and 36 25mm automatic cannons, weapons adequate for the combat environment of the late 1930s, but inadequate for what was coming. The Japanese carrier doctrine emphasized the decisive fleet engagement, the Kantai Kessen, in which massed airstrikes would achieve victory through overwhelming offensive power delivered against enemy carriers before they could launch their own aircraft. This offensive philosophy permeated every aspect of Japanese naval aviation, from training to tactics to ship design. Japanese carriers operated with minimal fighter combat air patrols, relying instead on early warning from reconnaissance aircraft and the speed with which they could launch interceptors from their flight decks once enemy aircraft were detected. This approach had worked brilliantly in December 1941 at Pearl Harbor, where Japanese carriers had achieved complete surprise and faced no organized fighter defense. It had worked at the Indian Ocean raid in April 1942, where British carriers lacking radar and adequate fighter cover were caught and destroyed. But by mid-1944, the technological and tactical environment had evolved in ways that Japanese naval doctrine had failed to anticipate or adapt to. The Grumman TBF Avenger represented the culmination of American industrial and engineering capabilities applied to the torpedo bomber role. Entering service in 1942, the Avenger was powered by a Wright OR 2600 twin-cyclone 14-cylinder radial engine producing 1900 horsepower, with a maximum speed of 275 miles per hour and a combat radius exceeding 1,000 miles when fully loaded. It was superior to any previous American torpedo bomber and significantly better than its Japanese counterpart, the aging Nakajima B 5N Kate. The Avenger's bomb bay could accommodate either a single Mark 13 torpedo weighing 2,000 pounds, 4 500-pound bombs, or specialized equipment for anti-submarine warfare. The aircraft featured a 3-man crew: pilot, turret gunner, and radio man bombardier ventral gunner. Its defensive armament included 2 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns in the wings, 1 50-caliber gun in a powered dorsal turret, and 1 30-caliber gun firing from a ventral position. What made the Avenger particularly effective was not just its performance characteristics, but its operational flexibility and the tactics developed for its employment. American naval aviators had spent years refining the coordinated attack doctrine that would maximize the effectiveness of torpedo bombers against heavily defended targets. The core principle was simultaneity, attacking from multiple directions at precisely the same moment to overwhelm defensive capabilities and eliminate evasive options. The anvil attack represented the most basic implementation of this principle. Torpedo bombers would divide into 2 groups, approaching the target vessel from angles roughly 90 degrees apart, typically both attacking the bow of the target ship. When the torpedoes were launched simultaneously from both sides, the target captain faced an impossible dilemma. Turning to present his bow to one group of torpedoes would expose his entire beam to the other group. The geometry was unforgiving and the mathematics brutal. Japanese carrier captains had limited options when facing such attacks. Unlike battleships with their massive armor belts and compartmentalized interiors designed to survive torpedo hits, carriers were fundamentally vulnerable vessels. Their flight decks, enormous open spaces necessary for aircraft operations, sat atop cavernous hangar bays filled with aviation gasoline, ordnance, and aircraft. The fuel lines and aviation gas storage tanks ran throughout the ship. A single torpedo hit could flood critical machinery spaces, disable steering, or breach fuel systems with catastrophic consequences. The speed advantage Japanese carriers once possessed had diminished by 1944. While carriers like Shokaku and Zuikaku could reach 34 knots maximum speed, this advantage mattered little when American torpedo bombers attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. Even the fastest ship could not outrun torpedoes approaching from 2 or more vectors. The only effective defense required what Japanese carriers increasingly lacked: early warning systems, robust combat air patrols, and concentrated anti-aircraft firepower. Radar was the technology that fundamentally altered the balance between attackers and defenders in carrier warfare. By 1944, American carriers and their screening vessels carried multiple radar systems. SK air search radar could detect incoming aircraft at ranges exceeding 75 miles, providing fighter directors with sufficient warning to vector combat air patrols toward threatening formations. Surface search radar enabled precise navigation and the detection of surface threats. Fire control radar directed anti-aircraft batteries with accuracy impossible with optical systems alone. Japanese carriers entered 1944 with minimal radar capabilities. Most carried only primitive air search sets with limited range and reliability. Without radar, Japanese fighter direction relied on visual observers spotting incoming aircraft, a method that provided minutes of warning rather than the 30 to 60 minutes American radar systems delivered. This technological disadvantage cascaded through every aspect of defensive operations. Consider the defensive challenge facing a Japanese carrier task force under attack by American aircraft in October 1944. Combat air patrol fighters, without radar guidance, orbited their carriers at altitudes between 15,000 and 20,000 feet, scanning visually for threats. When American strike aircraft appeared, often emerging from cloud cover or approaching at wave-top height, Japanese fighters had mere minutes to identify the threat, descend, to intercept, and engage. The American strike doctrine exploited this weakness systematically. Fighters would arrive first, engaging Japanese combat air patrol and anti-aircraft positions. Dive bombers would follow seconds later, attacking from high altitude to draw defensive fire skyward and cause topside damage that disrupted aircraft operations. Then, with anti-aircraft crews engaged against high-altitude threats and Japanese fighters pursuing dive bombers, the torpedo bombers would arrive at wave-top altitude from multiple directions simultaneously. The coordination required for this doctrine demanded sophisticated radio communications, precise navigation, and disciplined timing. American strike leaders, often flying specially equipped Avengers with enhanced radio equipment, coordinated these complex attacks from airborne command positions. They adjusted tactics based on real-time observations of enemy defenses, weather conditions, and the results of preceding waves. Japanese carriers attempting to defend against such coordinated attacks found themselves in an impossible tactical situation. Anti-aircraft guns could not engage aircraft attacking from multiple altitudes and directions simultaneously with equal effectiveness. Fighter combat air patrols, once committed against dive bombers or fighters, could not reposition quickly enough to intercept low-altitude torpedo bombers approaching from different vectors. The ships themselves, when maneuvering to evade torpedoes from one direction, often positioned themselves perfectly for attacks from another. The vulnerability window was measured in minutes, but those minutes determined outcomes. From the moment American radar detected incoming aircraft to the moment bombs and torpedoes struck their targets, Japanese carriers had perhaps six. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To 12 minutes to prepare their defense, fighter direction needed to vector combat air patrols toward the correct threat axis. Anti-aircraft batteries needed to train on targets and commence firing. The carrier itself needed to maneuver into wind to launch additional fighters while simultaneously taking evasive action. Each of these defensive requirements conflicted with the others. Launching fighters required steaming into wind, which often meant presenting the beam to attacking aircraft rather than the bow or stern that offered smaller targets. Evasive maneuvering disrupted aircraft launch operations and made fighter deck landings impossible. Concentrated anti-aircraft fire from screening vessels required formation discipline, but evasive action forced ships to break formation. By June 1944, these tactical and technological disadvantages had produced devastating results for Japanese naval aviation. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, fought June 19th through 20th near the Mariana Islands, demonstrated the complete collapse of Japanese carrier striking power against American defense capabilities. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet sortied with 9 aircraft carriers, embarking approximately 430 aircraft to challenge American forces, supporting the invasion of Saipan. What followed became known to American aviators as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. On June 19th, Ozawa launched 4 massive airstrikes against American Task Force 58, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitchell. The first Japanese strike, consisting of 69 aircraft, was detected by American radar at ranges exceeding 100 miles. Fighter directors aboard the carriers vectored over 50 Hellcat fighters toward the incoming raid. The Japanese formation, composed mostly of inexperienced replacement pilots, flew directly into a multi-layered fighter screen positioned between the American carriers and the incoming threat. The slaughter was systematic and one-sided. American fighters, guided by radar and coordinated by radio, intercepted the Japanese formations at high altitude, where American aircraft performance advantages were greatest. The remaining Japanese aircraft that penetrated the fighter screen encountered a wall of anti-aircraft fire from American vessels, equipped with proximity-fused shells that detonated near aircraft without requiring direct hits. Of the 69 Japanese aircraft in the first wave, 42 were destroyed, and most of the remainder damaged without achieving a single hit on American ships. The subsequent Japanese strikes fared no better. Throughout June 19th, Ozawa's carriers launched attack after attack, each time losing dozens of aircraft to American fighters and anti-aircraft fire. American radar provided sufficient warning that Japanese aircraft never achieved surprise. American fighter direction positioned interceptors perfectly to engage each incoming raid. The proximity fuse made American anti-aircraft fire devastating against any aircraft that penetrated the fighter screen. By day's end, Japanese naval aviation had suffered losses from which it would never recover. Of approximately 373 carrier aircraft launched in the 4 strikes on June 19th, at least 243 were destroyed in air-to-air combat. American submarines torpedoed and sank 2 Japanese fleet carriers, Taiho and Shokaku. A follow-up American counterattack on June 20th sank the light carrier Hio and damaged other vessels. The Battle of the Philippine Sea destroyed the IJN's ability to conduct large-scale carrier operations. The loss of experienced pilots, already decimated in earlier battles, meant that Japanese carriers entering the battles of late 1944 would do so with air groups composed largely of replacement pilots, with minimal training and almost no combat experience. These airmen, products of Japan's desperately compressed training pipeline, lacked the skills necessary to execute coordinated attacks or even basic defensive tactics. The technological and tactical situation had become even more desperate for Japanese forces by October 1944. American carrier task forces now operated with such overwhelming superiority that Japanese naval planners had abandoned any hope of achieving victory through carrier aviation. The Shogo plans, contingency operations for defending critical areas, relegated carriers to decoy roles, using them to lure American forces away from more valuable surface forces. This strategic desperation reflected a profound shift in the balance of naval power in the Pacific. Japanese carriers, which had dominated the war's opening months through superior aircraft, better trained pilots, and tactical doctrine emphasizing the decisive engagement, had become sacrificial assets in plans built around desperation rather than strategic coherence. The weapon that Japanese intelligence had once viewed as the decisive element in naval warfare had been rendered impotent by American technological advantages, industrial capacity, and tactical evolution. The vulnerability of Japanese carriers to coordinated torpedo attacks represented not just a tactical problem, but a strategic catastrophe. Without effective carrier aviation, Japan could not contest American control of the seas. Without control of the seas, Japan could not defend its maritime supply lines or prevent American forces from advancing toward the home islands. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Japanese carriers needed 6 minutes to detect, identify, and respond to incoming attacks. American attackers, approaching from 12 directions simultaneously with fighter cover and radar guidance, needed less than 2 minutes to execute coordinated strikes once within attack range. Those 4 minutes of differential represented the margin between successful defense and catastrophic loss. Japanese technological limitations, tactical doctrine frozen in pre-war concepts, and pilot inexperience meant that the margin could not be recovered through training, tactics, or operational skill. The vulnerability was structural and systemic, built into the fundamental design of Japanese carrier operations and the strategic choices that had prioritized offensive power over defensive resilience. The reality of Japanese carrier vulnerability manifested most dramatically during Operation Shogo 1, the Japanese Navy's desperate gamble to destroy American invasion forces at Leyte Gulf. Admiral Soimu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, had designed a complex plan requiring precise coordination between multiple naval forces converging on the Philippines from different directions. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's Northern Force, built around 4 aircraft carriers, would serve as bait to draw Admiral William Halsey's powerful Third Fleet away from the landing beaches. The carriers Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda sortied from Japan's inland sea with only 108 aircraft embarked among them. This anemic air group, roughly 1/4 the strength these same carriers would have carried 2 years earlier, represented everything Japanese naval aviation could scrape together. The pilots were mostly recent graduates of accelerated training programs, men with perhaps 100 hours of flight time attempting missions that veteran aviators with thousands of hours had found challenging. Ozawa understood his mission was sacrificial. The carriers existed to be seen, to be attacked, to die drawing American carrier aircraft away from the more powerful surface forces approaching Leyte Gulf from the west. On October 24th, Ozawa deliberately exposed his position, launching airstrikes designed more to reveal his presence than to inflict damage. American search aircraft spotted the Northern Force that afternoon, and Halsey, convinced this carrier force represented the primary threat, took the bait. At 1400 hours on October 25th, American carrier aircraft from Task Force 38 began their attack, runs against Ozawa's Northern Force. The contrast between this engagement and earlier carrier battles illustrated how completely the balance of power had shifted. 200 planes from 6 American carriers swept toward 4 Japanese carriers, defended by perhaps 30 operational fighters and minimal anti-aircraft coordination. The attack followed the doctrine refined through 3 years of combat. Hellcat fighters arrived first, engaging the thin Japanese combat air patrol and strafing anti-aircraft positions. The Japanese fighters, flown by pilots who lacked both the experience and aircraft performance to compete, were systematically destroyed or driven away. Within minutes, American fighters had achieved complete air superiority over the Japanese task force. Behind the fighters came the dive bombers, Curtiss SB-2C Helldivers dropping from 12,000 feet in 70-degree dives. The Japanese carriers attempted evasive maneuvers, but without effective fighter protection or radar warning, they had insufficient time to position themselves defensively. Bombs struck Zuikaku's flight deck, penetrating to the hangar deck where aviation, gasoline, and ordnance detonated in cascading explosions. Then came the Avengers, approaching from multiple directions in coordinated groups that exploited every principle of anvil attack doctrine. Lieutenant Commander James Minnie led 16 Avengers from the carrier Essex, dividing them into 3 attack groups that approached Zuikaku from her port bow, and starboard beam. The geometry left the Japanese carrier captain with no effective evasive option. Turning to comb torpedoes approaching from one direction exposed the full length of his ship to attacks from the other directions. The Avengers released their Mark 13 torpedoes at ranges between 800 and 1,000 yards, close enough to minimize the target's evasive time, but distant enough to allow the torpedoes to arm and reach proper running depth. The wooden stabilizer rings attached to the torpedoes' tails, developed through painful trial and error during the war's early years, kept the weapons running straight and true. The Mark 13, once one of the war's worst weapons, had evolved through systematic engineering into a reliable ship killer. Multiple torpedoes struck Zuikaku below the waterline. The 500-pound warheads detonated against her hull, each explosion creating a massive hole through which seawater flooded into machinery spaces and fuel compartments. Unlike American carriers, which incorporated extensive damage control systems and compartmentalization, Zuikaku's design emphasized aircraft capacity and speed over survivability. The flooding spread rapidly through spaces that lacked effective watertight doors and damage control equipment. The carrier's engineering spaces lost power as seawater reached boilers and electrical systems. Without power, pumps could not fight the flooding. Without pumps, the flooding accelerated. Within 20 minutes of the first torpedo hit, Zuikaku had developed a severe list. Her captain ordered the ship abandoned at 15:14 hours. At 15:57, the last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack force capsized and sank, taking 843 officers and men with her. The light carriers Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuiho met similar fates. American Avengers executed coordinated attacks from multiple directions, launching torpedoes while the carriers attempted futile evasive maneuvers. Chitose took 3 torpedo hits on her port side and sank within hours. Chiyoda, struck by at least 4 torpedoes and multiple bombs, lost power and became a drifting wreck that American cruisers finished with gunfire after dark. Zuiho absorbed repeated torpedo and bomb hits before capsizing. The destruction of Ozawa's northern force represented the complete validation of American carrier doctrine and the total collapse of Japanese defensive capabilities. 4 carriers, defending themselves with minimal fighter cover and inadequate anti-aircraft firepower against coordinated attacks by experienced pilots flying superior aircraft, had been destroyed in less than 4 hours of combat. The vulnerability window the Japanese carriers faced had proven exactly as catastrophic as tactical analysis predicted. But the most dramatic demonstration of how thoroughly American torpedo bomber tactics had evolved came not in the destruction of Ozawa's decoy carriers, but in the desperate battle fought simultaneously 300 miles to the south. There, off the coast of Samar Island, 6 American escort carriers found themselves under direct attack by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, including the super battleship Yamato and numerous heavy cruisers. The escort carriers of Taffy 3, commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, had been providing close air support for ground forces on Leyte when Kurita's battleships appeared over the horizon at dawn. These small carriers, built on merchant ship hulls and designed for anti-submarine warfare, had never been intended to fight surface warships. They carried Grumman FM-2 Wildcat fighters and TBM Avenger torpedo bombers configured for supporting ground troops, not attacking battleships. The Avengers launched from Taffy 3's carriers carried high-explosive bombs, depth charges, and rockets intended for attacking bunkers and submarines. Only a handful had been loaded with actual torpedoes, yet as Yamato's 18-inch guns fired salvos at the fleeing carriers, every available aircraft scrambled to attack, regardless of their weapons loadout. What followed demonstrated both the desperation of the tactical situation and the psychological impact of determined air attacks, even when those attacks lacked the ordnance necessary to sink heavily armored warships. Avengers carrying depth charges, weapons designed to destroy submarines through pressure rather than direct explosion, made attack runs on Japanese cruisers. The depth charges, set for shallow depths, exploded near the ship's hulls, causing minimal damage but forcing the vessels to maneuver evasively. Other Avengers, having expended their limited ordnance, made dry runs over Japanese ships, flying directly toward the vessels without dropping weapons. These feints forced anti-aircraft crews to engage and ships to maneuver, disrupting the pursuit of the escort carriers. Some pilots, having exhausted ammunition, simply orbited Japanese ships at low altitude, drawing fire away from more vulnerable vessels. The few Avengers that carried actual torpedoes executed attacks with a precision and coordination that reflected years of tactical refinement. Despite facing the heaviest concentration of anti-aircraft fire in the Japanese arsenal, the Avenger crews pressed their attacks from multiple directions. Lieutenant Paul Garrison, flying from the carrier Fanshawe Bay, led 3 Avengers in a coordinated attack on the heavy cruiser Kumano, approaching from 2 different angles to create the classic anvil situation. The torpedoes struck Kumano's bow, destroying her forward machinery and forcing her to retire from the battle. Similar attacks damaged or disabled other Japanese cruisers. The heavy cruiser Chokai, struck by a 500-pound bomb that detonated torpedoes on her deck, lost power and steering. The cruiser Chikuma took multiple torpedo hits that eventually led to her sinking. Even when the attacks did not sink their targets, they disrupted Japanese formations and prevented coordinated pursuit of the American carriers. The Battle off Samar demonstrated that the psychological and tactical impact of coordinated air attacks extended beyond the simple mathematics of ordnance tonnage. Japanese surface ships, designed and trained to engage enemy ships with guns and torpedoes, found themselves unable to maintain formation or execute coherent tactics when under continuous air attack from multiple directions. Captains maneuvered independently to evade torpedoes, breaking formation and preventing coordinated gunnery. Anti-aircraft crews engaged aircraft rather than surface targets, reducing the firepower available against the American destroyers making desperate torpedo runs. At 09:11 hours, after 2.5 hours of combat during which American air attacks had sunk 3 heavy cruisers and damaged other vessels, Admiral Kurita ordered his forces to withdraw. He believed, incorrectly, that he had engaged fleet carriers rather than escort carriers, and feared that additional American carrier forces were approaching. The reality was that coordinated air attacks by lightly armed aircraft, combined with destroyer torpedo attacks and the confusion of combat, had convinced a superior surface force to retreat when victory was within reach. The tactical lessons from both engagements were unmistakable. Japanese carriers, even when serving as deliberate sacrificial decoys, could not survive coordinated attacks by American carrier aircraft. The 6-minute window between radar detection and attack execution proved insufficient for Japanese forces, lacking effective fighter direction, robust combat air patrols, or concentrated anti-aircraft firepower. Approaching from 12 directions simultaneously, American torpedo bombers could execute anvil attacks that eliminated all effective evasive options for the target vessel. The Mark 13 torpedo, refined through years of engineering effort, now functioned reliably when dropped from altitudes up to 800 feet and speeds approaching 300 miles per hour. The wooden stabilizer rings and box tail assemblies developed by engineers at the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island, had transformed a weapon notorious for failure into one of the war's most effective ship killers. In 1944 alone, American Avengers launched 2,487 Mark 13 torpedoes, achieving 514 hits, a success rate exceeding 20%. The improvement in torpedo performance paralleled broader improvements in American naval aviation. Proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells detonated near enemy aircraft without requiring direct hits. Radar-directed fighter interception positioned American fighters to achieve maximum advantage before engaging. Superior aircraft like the F-6 F Hellcat, with its 2,000 horsepower engine and heavy armament, dominated Japanese fighters in every performance category that mattered. But technological superiority alone did not explain American success or Japanese failure. The tactical doctrine that emphasized coordinated attacks from multiple directions, developed through fleet exercises during the interwar period and refined through combat experience, multiplied the effectiveness of individual weapons. A single Avenger, attacking from one direction, gave the target captain clear, evasive options. 3 groups of Avengers attacking simultaneously from different compass bearings eliminated those options entirely. Japanese defensive doctrine, frozen in concepts developed during the 1930s when carriers operated individually or in small groups and attacks came from single directions, it had failed to evolve as American tactics grew more sophisticated. Japanese fighter direction remained primitive even when radar became available, relying on centralized control that could not adapt rapidly to multi-axis threats. Anti-aircraft gunnery, lacking proximity-focused ammunition and radar direction, achieved far lower hit rates than American systems. The training differential had become equally stark. By late 1944, American carrier pilots averaged over 300 hours of flight training before joining combat squadrons, with many veteran pilots exceeding 1,000 hours of total flight time. Japanese replacement pilots, products of training programs, compressed from years into months, often reached combat units with less than 100 hours of flight time and minimal instrument or formation training. This inexperience manifested in fundamental tactical failures. Japanese strike formations approaching American task forces often circled at high altitude to reform before attacking, wasting precious minutes, while American radar tracked their movements and fighter directors positioned interceptors. Once engaged, inexperienced Japanese pilots broke formation and attacked individually, rather than maintaining coordinated strikes. These failures transformed what might have been effective attacks into piecemeal assaults that American defenses systematically destroyed. The strategic implications of Japanese carrier vulnerability extended far beyond individual battles. Without effective carrier aviation, Japan could not contest American naval supremacy in the Philippine Sea, meaning American forces could isolate and destroy Japanese garrisons throughout the Central Pacific. Without effective carrier aviation, Japan could not defend its maritime supply lines from submarine attack, meaning the merchant shipping essential for sustaining both the military and civilian economy was systematically destroyed. The loss of trained pilots represented an irreplaceable strategic asset, unlike ships, which could be built in months, or aircraft, which rolled off production lines by the thousands. Experienced pilots required years to train and could not be rapidly replaced. Each major engagement depleted Japan's pool of skilled aviators, and the compressed training programs designed to replace them produced pilots barely capable of basic flight operations, much less complex combat missions. By November 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force existed primarily on paper. The surviving carriers remained in port, unable to sortie because they lacked sufficient aircraft or trained pilots to form viable air groups. The few operational aircraft were held in reserve for kamikaze attacks, suicide missions that expended both aircraft and pilots in single-use strikes. The carrier, which Japanese doctrine had identified as the decisive weapon in naval warfare, had become an expensive and vulnerable asset without practical military value. The final vindication of American torpedo bomber doctrine came on April 7, 1945, in the waters between Kyushu and Okinawa. The super battleship Yamato, pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy and the largest battleship ever constructed, sortied on a suicide mission designated Operation 10 Go. With fuel for only a one-way voyage, Yamato was to beach herself on Okinawa and use her 18.1-inch guns as fixed artillery supporting the garrison defending against American invasion. The mission was desperate theater, a gesture designed to demonstrate fighting spirit rather than achieve military objectives. Yamato's escort consisted of the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers, insufficient to provide effective anti-aircraft defense. The task force carried no air cover. Japanese naval aviation had been so thoroughly destroyed that no fighters could be spared to protect even the Navy's most powerful remaining vessel. American submarines detected Yamato's sortie almost immediately. Codebreakers had already provided advance warning of the operation. By the morning of April 7th, American carrier task forces knew Yamato's position, course, and speed. Vice Admiral Mark Mitchell, commanding Task Force 58, launched a massive strike of nearly 400 aircraft from multiple carrier groups. The attack began shortly after noon. Hellcat fighters strafed Yamato's anti-aircraft positions, suppressing defensive fire. Helldiver dive bombers attacked from high altitude, seeking to damage topside installations and create confusion. Then the Avengers arrived, executing the coordinated multi-directional attacks that had become the hallmark of American torpedo bomber tactics. Lieutenant Thomas Stetson led Avengers from the carrier Bennington in the first torpedo attack, approaching Yamato's port side while aircraft from other carriers positioned themselves to attack from starboard. The super battleship, designed to absorb punishment that would sink any other vessel, attempted evasive maneuvers, but against torpedoes approaching from port, starboard, bow, and stern simultaneously, no amount of maneuvering could avoid every weapon. The first torpedoes struck Yamato's port side, blasting holes through armor that, while thick, could not withstand the cumulative effect of multiple explosions. Additional waves of Avengers pressed their attacks over the next 2 hours. The coordination was methodical and professional. Attack groups waited for optimal positioning before launching torpedoes, ensuring that Yamato faced threats from multiple directions simultaneously throughout the engagement. Yamato's anti-aircraft fire, while heavy, could not concentrate effectively against attacks from 12 different compass bearings. Gun crews engaging aircraft attacking from port could not simultaneously engage aircraft attacking from starboard. The battleship's secondary battery, designed to engage surface targets, proved largely ineffective against aircraft approaching at wave-top altitude from multiple directions. By 1400 hours, Yamato had absorbed at least 10 torpedo hits and multiple bomb strikes. The cumulative flooding overwhelmed her pumping capacity. The massive battleship developed a severe list to port that her crew could not correct. At 1423 hours, Yamato capsized and exploded, creating a mushroom cloud visible for dozens of miles. Of her crew of 3,332, only 280 survived. The destruction of Yamato represented the ultimate vindication of carrier aviation over the battleship, but more specifically, it demonstrated the lethal effectiveness of coordinated torpedo attacks against even the most heavily armored vessel ever built. The tactics developed through years of fleet exercises and refined through combat had proven capable of sinking a battleship designed to be unsinkable. The 6-minute vulnerability window that had doomed Japanese carriers proved equally fatal to the most powerful surface combatant ever constructed. The Avengers' combat record across the Pacific War told the story of American tactical and technological evolution. At Midway in June 1942, 6 Avengers attacking from Midway Island had been slaughtered by Japanese fighters, with 5 shot down and the survivor badly damaged. The aircraft had been new, the tactics undeveloped, the torpedoes unreliable, but by 1944, the same basic aircraft, now equipped with reliable torpedoes and flown by well-trained crews executing sophisticated tactics, had become the most effective torpedo bomber of the war. The statistical record reflected this transformation. Avengers were credited with sinking the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, the largest battleships ever built. They sank or heavily damaged numerous Japanese carriers, including Shokaku, Zuikaku, Hio, and the light carriers that formed Ozawa's northern force. They disabled or sank dozens of cruisers, destroyers, and merchant vessels. In anti-submarine warfare, Avengers claimed approximately 30 submarine kills, including sophisticated Japanese cargo submarines, attempting to run supplies to isolated garrisons. The production numbers reflected the aircraft's importance to American naval strategy. Grumman and General Motors' Eastern Aircraft Division produced 9,836 Avengers between 1942 and 1945. At the peak of production, factories delivered aircraft at rates exceeding 100 per month. This industrial capacity, combined with the training infrastructure that produced thousands of qualified pilots and aircrew, represented American advantages that Japan could not match or counter. But the deeper lesson extended beyond individual weapons systems or tactical doctrines. The Japanese carrier vulnerability that American torpedo bombers exploited so effectively stemmed from systemic failures in Japanese naval development. The emphasis on offensive striking power at the expense of defensive resilience created carriers that could deliver devastating first strikes, but could not survive coordinated counterattacks. The failure to develop radar and integrate it into fighter direction systems left Japanese carriers blind until enemy aircraft appeared visually. The inability to produce proximity-focused anti-aircraft ammunition meant Japanese anti-aircraft fire remained far less effective than American systems. Perhaps most critically, Japanese naval aviation failed to develop the institutional capability to learn from combat experience and rapidly implement improvements. American naval aviation evolved continuously throughout the war. Tactics that failed were analyzed and revised. Equipment that proved inadequate was redesigned. Training programs incorporated lessons from combat to produce pilots better prepared for the operational environment they would face. This institutional learning, supported by industrial capacity that could rapidly implement improvements and training infrastructure that could disseminate new tactics, represented advantages that multiplied over time. Japanese naval aviation, by contrast, remained trapped in doctrines developed during the 1930s and validated by early war successes. The Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle doctrine, remained the foundation of Japanese naval strategy, even after American industrial capacity and technological advantages made such battles unwinnable for Japan. Fighter direction remained centralized and inflexible, even when radar made decentralized direction more effective. Carrier, a doctrine continued, emphasizing offensive striking power even when American defensive capabilities made such strikes suicidal. The human cost of these systemic failures was measured in thousands of Japanese sailors and aviators who died in battles their commanders had no realistic prospect of winning. The escort carrier Taiho, newest and most advanced Japanese carrier when commissioned in March 1944, sank at the Battle of the Philippine Sea after a single submarine torpedo hit triggered aviation fuel explosions. Her loss, along with veteran carrier Shokaku, sunk the same day, killed over 2,000 officers and men. These deaths occurred not because Japanese sailors lacked courage or skill, but because their ship's design and defensive doctrine could not survive the American tactical and technological environment of mid-1944. The replacement pilots sent to fill the gaps left by veteran aviators killed in combat died in even greater numbers. Young men with minimal training, flying obsolete aircraft against well-trained opponents, flying superior machines, had survival rates measured in weeks rather than months. The kamikaze program, which institutionalized suicide attacks as standard operational procedure, represented the ultimate admission that Japanese naval aviation could no longer compete in conventional combat. The strategic consequences of Japanese carrier vulnerability reverberated throughout Japan's war effort. Without effective carrier aviation, Japan could not defend shipping routes between the home islands and the resource areas in Southeast Asia that supplied critical raw materials. American submarines, operating with near impunity across Japanese maritime routes, sank merchant vessels faster than Japanese shipyards could replace them. By 1945, Japanese bulk commodity imports had collapsed to a fraction of wartime requirements. The oil shortage became particularly acute. Japan had gone to war in large part to secure access to petroleum resources in the Dutch East Indies. But without the ability to defend tanker routes, those resources remained inaccessible. The surviving units of the combined fleet remained in port not because commanders lacked fighting spirit, but because fuel shortages made operations impossible. Yamato's final sortie occurred only because the Navy scraped together enough fuel for a one-way voyage. The collapse of maritime logistics affected not just military operations, but the entire Japanese economy. Merchant shipping losses meant that industrial raw materials could not reach factories. Food supplies could not reach urban populations. The systematic strangulation of Japan's maritime commerce, achieved primarily through submarine warfare, but enabled by the destruction of Japanese naval aviation's ability to provide convoy protection, created conditions of desperation that made Japan's defeat inevitable regardless of battlefield outcomes. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 and the Soviet entry into the war provided the immediate catalysts for Japanese surrender. But the strategic situation those events terminated had been created by the systematic destruction of Japanese maritime power, of which carrier aviation represented the most visible and dramatic component. The Avengers that sank Yamato, destroyed Ozawa's carriers, and disabled dozens of other vessels were instruments of a broader strategic campaign that severed Japan's connection to the resources necessary for sustaining modern warfare. The story of Japanese carrier vulnerability and American torpedo bomber effectiveness ultimately illustrated how wars are won not through individual tactical brilliance or technological superiority in isolation, but through the systematic integration of multiple advantages. American success stemmed from superior technology applied through effective tactics, supported by industrial capacity that could produce weapons in overwhelming numbers, enabled by training infrastructure that produced skilled personnel, and refined through institutional learning that incorporated combat lessons into continuous improvement. Japanese failure reflected the inverse of each advantage. Technological disadvantages in radar and fire control multiplied tactical disadvantages in doctrine and coordination. Industrial limitations meant that even effective weapons could not be produced in sufficient numbers. Training constraints produced pilots inadequately prepared for combat. Institutional rigidity prevented the incorporation of combat lessons into improved doctrine and equipment. The 6 minutes between radar detection and torpedo impact represented not just a tactical vulnerability, but the manifestation of these systemic differences. American attackers, guided by radar, directed by sophisticated fighter control, flying superior aircraft with reliable weapons, executing tactics refined through combat experience, needed only those 6 minutes to achieve decisive results. Japanese defenders, lacking effective radar warning, flying obsolete aircraft with inadequate training, defending according to doctrine developed before the war began, could not respond effectively within that compressed time frame. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.